Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 9 game from the Xtracon Open. Now, if you followed the round 8 video, you know that I won a game playing down against a FIDE master from Germany, and that was actually extremely important to kind of get me back in the hunt. And so before this game, I was actually on 6 out of 8 points. So I had 6 from 8 against pretty strong opposition. Thus far in the tournament, I'd actually played several Grandmasters over 2600. In fact, I believe I'd played 4 Grandmasters over 2600 to this point, and this was about to be my 5th Grandmaster above 2600. So I knew that my norm chances were actually pretty decent, and this actually should give me a decent opportunity to talk about those norm chances. So typically, I have a rule of thumb not to even entertain a GM norm until the last 2 rounds of a tournament, because especially in an open tournament, you can't actually project who you're going to play and things of that nature. But with 2 rounds to go, it becomes more concrete, and so you can start to think about your strategy with white and with black and so on. And I was actually in a scenario now almost similar to what I'd had in the Reykjavik Open much earlier in the year, where I pretty much was in a situation where I had 1 white and 1 black, and I needed to kind of make my move or decide what the strategy was. Now, in the Reykjavik Open, way back when, I'd actually decided to play for all out for a win with white, knowing or thinking that I need to hit 1 point from my next 2 games. And so I thought that, even if I lost with white, I'd still have an opportunity to get the full point with black playing down, and then that would get me a GM norm in that particular tournament. Now, unfortunately, in the Reykjavik Open, what wound up happening is that I lost that game with white against Grandmaster Arjan Tariq. Coincidentally, I played him in this event, and then I actually did get paired down with black. But unfortunately, even though I won my last round game with black, I didn't get the pairing that I needed. I needed someone that was around 24 in the 2400 range, and I actually played someone that was about 2350, and that meant that even with a win, it wasn't enough to secure a norm. So basically, the lesson that I learned from that particular event is that when you lose a game, and you do play so significantly down, you never know how things are going to kind of shake out with your pairings. And so it's actually extremely risky to kind of, go all out, and then, if you lose, you play down, and then it's not really up to you anymore. So whereas if you draw 2 times, you're going to be playing the same type of strong player twice in a row, because when you draw, you typically play around the same type of opponent. So basically, to sum it up, getting to that 1 point is actually extremely important. And so the draw is actually more, it's more guaranteed of, you actually getting a chance at the norm than loss-win. So even though they're both 1 point, not all points are created equal as far as the rating of your opposition. And so essentially going into this one, I figured, you know what? I am white. I do want to win for sure. I mean, I want to press if I can, but a draw is not going to hurt my chances. And so that was kind of my rationale going into this. And so I was trying to play relatively safely, but if the opportunity came, I would try and go for it. But a loss was what I did not want under any circumstances, because I figured that would kill my chance. So, okay, I didn't actually say who I was playing after this soliloquy. My opponent in this one was Grandmaster Igor Lysyj from Russia. Very, very strong Grandmaster. At the time of this game, he was around 2620, and I believe now he's actually a little under 2600, but playing is no longer his priority, I would say. A few years back, he peaked at 2,700 FIDE, so he was at one time around top 30, top 40 in the world. I actually spoke to him after the game, and now he's doing quite a bit of coaching and things of that nature, so playing is definitely not his priority anymore, but he's extremely, extremely strong player, and this was going to be a tough challenge. All right, so let's get into it. So I was white, and I'm with d4, and I saw that Igor played a lot of like Nimzo-Indian type of structure, so I was kind of expecting something along the e6, knight f6 type of lane, and he played e6, move 1. And this was actually not a surprise to me either, because he seemed to be a Nimzo, French, Dutch type of player, and sometimes he played Dutch, but if you're a French defense type of player with black, and he actually almost religiously plays the French. Sometimes he'll go e5 or c5. Like, of course, Grandmasters are mostly a little bit more flexible than just one opening, but his favorite opening for many, many years was the French, from what I could see. So if you're a French player, 1 e6 is pretty awesome, because it invites the French, but it also, cuts out some lines that black might entertain. So, for instance, or white might entertain. So, for instance, if you play knight f6 right away, well, here black can, be faced with Trumpowski and with bishop g5, for instance, and with e6. Note that, obviously Trumpowski is not possible because the queen is right there guarding that square. So e6 is a really, nice flexible way to get into many different systems if you're a French player, and you know that your opponent's not going to really want to play e4. So anyways, I went c4. And now I expected knight f6 and for us to go back into traditional queen-pawn lines. But here I was surprised almost instantly when Igor played the move b6. And this move was a shock to my system, because it basically had thrown out all of the preparation I'd done the night before and the morning of. I'd spent 4 or 5 hours looking at all these different lines where I think I'd get, slight chances for an edge and all this stuff. And all of a sudden from b6, he's, basically, playing in a very, very hyper-modern way, inviting me to take the center with e4. But those are the really concrete lines and not lines I had explored. So, I actually went for knight f3, but just to give you a window into what, taking the center would look like, I was aware that there was a line with e4, bishop b7, challenging this pawn on e4, and bishop d3. And I'd actually seen in some rapid games at the highest level this move bishop b4 check, and then king f1, believe it or not. The idea now with the king on f1, I cover the g2 pawn in some lines that can be a little bit sensitive, and instead of trading a minor piece on d2, which allows black to again, trading pieces are good when you lack space in the center. Instead, you argue that the bishop on b4 is now a little bit misplaced, vulnerable to attack, but obviously very unclear position with the king on f1. There's also a line with f5, and e takes f5 is, there's this move knight f6 I've seen before, and the idea here is that you're actually, it's actually a pawn sacrifice for which black is trying to develop very quickly and castle and get some compensation. And again, I knew these lines, vaguely, but I didn't, do any work here. So to go for something like this without any real knowledge is extremely risky, and I opted against it. I should also point out that bishop takes g2 here is actually an option, but it's actually a losing move. And I knew this was actually, very good for white, but I didn't know why. So I'll just show you why bishop takes g2 isn't good here. Queen h5 check is very important. And after g6, note that king e7, it just loses on the spot to queen g5 check, picking up the bishop on g2. So you need to go g6. And after g6, f takes g6, it looks like g7 is going to be a major threat, a major move hitting the rook on h8 and just queening. But black can play bishop g7, and after g takes h7 check, king f8. And this position is not as clear. Knight e2 is the move that's played, and after knight f6, queen h4, bishop takes h1, bishop g5, and essentially the line continues, but the basic concept is that even though white is temporarily a rook down, he's going to either get the bishop on h1 or the knight on f6, and with the king on f8 being in its current position, it is vulnerable to attack. But of course, if you don't know the details of this line, again, I'm regurgitating some lines that the computer and some games I've seen in the database, you're not going to go for this. And I did not want to have any part of this tricky, b6 complex. So again, knight f3 was my choice. Now, I will point out, because Igor pointed out after the game that actually after e4, the move that he was planning to play, and the move that's actually kind of was a bit trendy in the past year or so, was actually bishop b4 check right away. And the idea is actually after bishop d2, bishop takes d2, and queen takes d2, not to play bishop b7, but to actually play d5. And there actually have been dozens of stem games here that you can check in the database, but the idea is actually after cd5, ed5, black actually puts the knight on e7 and actually argues that he has no problems after an eventual c5. So if white tries to play keep the structure and play e5 and play with the kingside pawn majority, well, actually knight e7, knight f3, castles, bishop d3, and c5. And black's actually doing quite reasonably here. There isn't really much of an attack going on the king side and on h7 right now, because white's a little bit too undeveloped, and the center is not completely stable either, with c takes d4 or knight c6 or bishop a6 all being interesting options, or even sometimes this bishop coming on to this diagonal, whether it's e6, f5, or g4. And so actually black has a pretty reasonable position here, and there was a game in particular in this line that happened between Ding Liren and Richer Report that Igor cited as being one that was something that gave some life to the line. So definitely an interesting continuation if you're a e6 b6 aficionado. But yeah, I was not trying to have any of that stuff. And so I went for the move knight f3. Now, my hope, or my, if you will, was that he would, go knight f6 and we'd steer the game towards Queen's Indian positions. But Igor was still intent on playing very dynamically and went for bishop b7 right away. After bishop b7, I still thought, okay, maybe we can get a Queen's Indian position, a position I understand. And I went for the move a3. Now, there are also other moves. There's g3. That would be an option. But again, I was a little bit wary of some of these dynamic choices like bishop takes f3, even though I know this position wouldn't be bad for white. White does have the two bishops here. I was kind of trying to sterilize the position, rid it of dynamics, in which he might have some more familiarity than me. And that's why I went for a3. But g3 is an option. And also knight c3 is an option, but here now bishop b4, again, keeps the position fairly dynamic. In some lines tries to ruin my pawn structure. I just wasn't trying to have that. And so after bishop b7, I went for a3, trying to essentially get it to the a3 versions of the Queen's Indian, which I am somewhat familiar with. So after a3, I was angling for knight f6 and then knight c3, and then we have that Petrosian line of the Queen's Indian. But again, Igor was intent on playing dynamically and played the move f5 here. And this is pretty much as ambitious as it gets. He's saying, I'm going to, try and anchor myself on this e4 square, really control this square, put my knight on f6. And you haven't really challenged my Dutch setup, playing these slow moves with a3 and stuff. So, I can get away with this. So, very interesting way to play. I went knight c3 now, and now knight f6 was played. And the question for me here was how to proceed with my development. If I played e3, that seemed a little bit too modest because my bishop on c1 would be shut out of the game. And of course, black still has the e4 square, so I didn't love e3. If I go for g3, I could kind of switch to the Queen's Indian setups with a fianchetto, but it begs the question, what was the point of a3? So I wasn't totally certain of that. And yeah, g3 is playable, like in bishop e7, bishop g2, knight. But knight e4, this move kind of, made me question, well, was a3 just kind of a loss of time if I was going to go for this setup? So I didn't really want to go for this. And so what I landed on was actually probably not surprising given the types of positions I've played in openings before, but I went for bishop f4, essentially trying to make it a London system of sorts, getting the bishop outside the chain, then playing pawn e3, trying to maximize the utility of all the moves I've already made. And this is a very interesting and viable way to play, but we'll see if it actually works. So after bishop f4, I expected bishop e7, but now black actually played g6. And this is actually very, very interesting because he's essentially going to double fianchetto, and now it's kind of a hybrid of a Dutch Leningrad and Stonewall because, he has control over e4, but he also hasn't played d6 and c6 as is typical, and just a very original position. After g6, I now went e3 because I'm trying to hustle to develop myself. And after bishop g7, I went bishop e2. Part of the reason I thought e2 made a little bit more sense than d3 is because if you play d3, you're kind of blocking the queen from, reinforcing the center after if any pawn break is played. And I also thought that if the knight comes to e4, now I couldn't actually take on e4 with my knight because there'd be a fork of my bishop and my knight. So I thought bishop e2, even though it seems like the more modest, diagonal is actually more precise. And after bishop e2, black actually castled. And here's actually another kind of critical position because I actually castled really quickly, but in hindsight, there were better moves to kind of challenge black a little bit. If you consider that knight e4 is probably something that's in the cards for black, one idea to kind of preempt that would be a move like h4. And obviously, this is extremely aggressive and not kind of in the vein of the type of game I wanted to play, which was more of a controlled game because I didn't want to go all out. But h4 is actually quite interesting because if you make a move like d6, h5 actually becomes a very legitimate possibility. Obviously, g takes h5 kind of ruins the pawn structure and gives white counterpoint in the h-file. And if knight takes h5, there's actually knight g5, taking advantage of the e6 pawn being a bit sensitive, attacking the h5 knight several times. And after knight takes f4, e takes f4, there's now pressure on h7 as well. And position after rook e8 and rook takes h7 is the type of position that's just a total mess. Obviously, my king is not castled. It might not castle for a little while. I do have some vague initiative on the king side, but it's extremely risky to play like this. Extremely risky. So not something that I was really seriously looking at during the game, but is an option. Another way, a little more tepid way of just not delaying castling just a moment is actually queen c2. And by playing queen c2, I actually tease the idea of castling queenside, and I also just reinforce the knight on c3. So both interesting ways to play. Instead, after castles, black actually played h6, calling into question the position of my bishop on f4. But actually, knight e4 is more prudent and actually quite a decent move because I don't really want to double these pawns on the c-file with a b takes c3. So I probably would be going queen c2 now. And now after knight takes c3, queen takes e3, and d6, I think this position would be a little bit easier to play for black, even though the position is evaluated by engines to be equal. Essentially, the issue that I have to contend with all the time is my bishop on f4. Even though it's outside the chain, it always can be harassed with g5 or e5 at some point. And I just think the build up to one of these breaks is actually something I have to worry about. And I'm not so sure where white's breaks are coming from, because obviously I can't play d5 here because my queen is vulnerable. And even if my queen wasn't on c3, there's certain circumstances where d5 actually, lends itself to e5, and then the position remains closed, and black has this kind of King's Indian type of flair on the king side going on. So those are, things I kind of have to be worried about. So yeah, that's kind of the thing that was the persistent theme in the position was, well, my bishop on f4 is outside of the chain, but how good is it really? Is it going to be vulnerable to attack and so on? And so after h6, this already kind of is a question. Well, g5 might trouble me a little bit. My bishop becomes a little bit vulnerable, and I didn't really want to allow these types of exchanges of bishop for knight when I thought this bishop is bearing down on this diagonal and this one is already on g7. I thought giving the two bishops for nothing might be a little bit risky. And you might say, well, don't you have h3? I mean, that's typically the London move to preserve the London bishop. Well, here h3 isn't as attractive because, it actually kind of gives, black a hook to kind of, play g5 and g4 and kind of advance on the king side. So because of that dynamic, I was really not enthusiastic about playing h3, and I figured if my bishop was going to survive or even play on this diagonal, it was going to have to be without h3. So after h6, I thought that, okay, g5 is a legitimate move. I need to get on with something in the center. I mean, when a flank move is played, you play in the middle. And so I decided to play the move d5. I thought this was probably the most principled move to play in the center. Also, in some lines, I secure some squares for my bishop on this diagonal, and I thought it was just an important move to make. Another option, d5 is actually a good move, but another option is actually rook c1. The point is that, again, if g5, I can just drop to g3 or e5. And if you go d6, which seemed to me the most natural move in the position, again, trying to limit my squares on this diagonal, I actually have the move c5 here. And the point is that actually this is a pawn sacrifice, but it actually really ruins black's structure. So you can't really take on c5 twice. This would be extremely nonsensical. I have queen takes d8 if I want. I have queen b3 if I want. These pawns are just too weak. So you're not going to take twice on c5. And if you go knight h5, trying to secure my bishop, well, I can actually play c takes d6. And after c takes d6, go bishop c4. And actually, losing the two bishops here is not really a problem because, as I've highlighted, I have good counterplay on the c-file with my rook and good counterplay on the diagonal with my bishop. So those dynamics, allow white to give up the bishop pair pretty much. So rook c1 was playable. Anyways, d5 is also quite good. You play through the middle, you get this initiative going. Not a problem at all. And it's actually because d5 is an option that one could argue that d6 would have been a little bit more sensible, just because now if d5, then e5 is, a break that would kind of lock up the position and challenge my bishop on f4. So anyway, h6, d5, and now black went knight a6, which is quite thematic, and this is actually something that reminds me of Queen's Indians, because there's this line in the Queen's Indian, this d5 sacrifice. I think it's called the Polgaevsky Gambit, and if black wants to decline the Polgaevsky Gambit with d5, this move knight a6 happens, and then the knight maneuvers to c5, and black tries to play around the pawn on d5, and also take advantage of the e4 square, which is a little bit sensitive if the knight comes to c5. So knight a6 was a move that made some sense to me. And here's actually another critical position, because it's obviously a little bit messy. All the pieces and pawns are still on the board, and I need to come up with something quite concrete to kind of, challenge black's plans. And again, black is trying to play around the d5 pawn. So knight c5 is an option. Queen e7, rook e8 might be a move. g5 might be a move. And I need to try and come up with something quite concrete. Now, the move I played was not the best move, but why don't you pause the video and try to come up with what you consider the best move in the position to be. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and come up with what you think the most principled line is. Actually, turns out in this position, the best move for white is actually the very thematic b4. And the concept here is actually just to prevent the knight from coming to c5 and kind of lock it out of play. And after b4, black would actually have some serious difficulties because, again, this knight's not coming in the game, and white has really good control in the center. Note that d5 is very secure, and really the only way that black can try to challenge this move with b4 is actually the move knight e4. Taking advantage of the knight being loose on c3 and the rook on a1 behind it being hanging. But it actually turns out here that exchange sacrifices are in white's favor. And after knight takes e4, f takes e4, and knight d2, white's really happy to give up the exchange here. After g5 is a reasonable intermediate move, bishop g3, and then bishop takes a1, queen takes a1. I've drawn a lot of messy arrows here, but it's basically to describe the scope of all of white's pieces. My bishop on e2 is actually bearing down on the knight on a6, meaning that black can't capture twice on d5. My bishop on g3 is bearing down on the pawn on c7. The knight on d2 is already hitting the pawn on e4. And the queen on a1 is pretty decent on the long diagonal. And so even though I actually don't even have a pawn for the exchange right now, just the activity of white's pieces really gives white a serious advantage here. And this knight on a6 is going to be passive and out of play for a long time. So it actually feels like white actually has two pieces for the rook. And last but not least, the king side, black's king side is actually quite sensitive, having played h6 and g5 and then lost the dark squared bishop. This also gives white some prospects. So this is a type of position where white would actually be for choice, and it's something that I probably should have taken a little more seriously. Instead, I was still kind of in be solid, kind of control the game mode, and I went for the move d6. And my idea here was that with the move d6, I would actually secure the diagonal for my bishop. I'd secure the e5 square, so g5 I thought would no longer trap my bishop or hassle my bishop too seriously. But the issue with d6, I'm actually releasing some of the tension in the center and giving the bishop on b7 full scope on the diagonal, and that's actually why it would have been better to just keep the pawn on d5. After d6, black played knight e8, and this is actually a good move, just attacking the pawn on d6 and now forcing me to release the tension, because otherwise I would just lose the bishop pair. And the other thing that's good about knight e8, which really bothered me, is now g5 is on the cards again in some lines after an exchange on c7. So this kind of forces my hand, and I actually went d takes c7. And now after knight a takes c7, we have a very interesting position where only one pawn is off the board, and my bishop on f4 is still there. But it's really a question of, who's going to get their plans going first. Black really wants to get in sort of g5, maybe g4, really hassle this bishop and maybe even this knight on f3, and really play in the middle and on the king side. And really, my only play is going to be on the C and D files. So I need to try and get something going in the center before black gets this roller going on the king side. And I was really, concerned that, black might be first. The other thing that was concerning is that if black plays the move d6, all of a sudden my bishop doesn't have any business squares on the diagonal going forward, and g5 and f4 might be an idea, or g5 and h5, and I was just really worried about my bishop being caught. And so I had to be pretty hasty, and that's why I played the move queen d2. And my idea with queen d2 was that I was going to very quickly, put a rook on d1 and try to trouble the backward d pawn. Black now went for the move g5, challenging this bishop on f4 right away. I would actually argue for the move d6. I think that's a little bit more sensible. The point is that after rook a d1, now e5 can be played, and even though the d pawn is backward, Black has really good, control in the center here, and also really good control over the d5 square, so I can't just plop a knight there. And after this retreat and queen e7, Black can play rook d8 and then get on with g5 and potentially f4 and just try to begin this roller on the king side. And at the end of the day now, I do have a little bit of space in the center, but Black has a lot of space on the king side, and with all the pieces on the board still, space is going to be a real factor here that decides the game. So yeah, I think g5 is a little bit more precise, d6 is a little bit more precise, but g5 is also fine. So after g5, I will go bishop g3, and the saving grace here is that f4 doesn't actually trap my bishop because my queen is eyeing that square as well, and in some lines I can actually take on f4 and go bishop h4 because my knight's guarding that square. So my bishop is secure for now. But now Igor played d6, and you can see I'm losing more control on this diagonal, and I have to be quick. And so I actually went for the move rook a d1 because I thought now the pawn is on d6, I need to try and get some counterplay through the middle, and now it's actually a target. Igor actually went queen f6 here, and this is actually a very, very concrete and interesting idea, just giving up the d6 pawn. Again, the point is that he's arguing that by giving up the d6 pawn, he might actually get some counterplay on the d file, and that the two bishops are more important than the pawn on d6. And I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure whether he was right or not, but I figured that I would need to take this pawn because otherwise I thought I was just going to get squeezed. So I thought I might as well grab the material and make him prove the compensation than just sit around and do nothing. Because if I don't take the pawn, I'm not even sure what my next move is. How do I improve? I mean, I can't really... this knight, I don't know where this knight on c3 is going. b2 is loose. Bishop on e2, I don't know if it goes to d3, it's just blocking my play on the d file. So I didn't actually see any other move besides taking on d6. And that's why I went for it. Now, the one thing I had to check with bishop d6 was just making sure that rook d8 was not a decisive pin. But what I found here is that in this position, I can actually go bishop takes f8. And the point is that if rook takes d2, I have bishop g7, and I'm hitting the queen on f6. So this is a position that's totally fine for me because having two rooks for the queen would be a position where white is actually better. So I did see that I had this intermediate move, bishop takes f8, and then bishop g7, and this allows me to have an advantage. So rook d8 was not something I need to worry about. So anyways, after bishop takes d6, knight takes d6 was played, and I went queen takes d6, and the knight on c7 is a little bit misplaced. It can't go forward in the center, and it's just kind of weird there, and it also requires protection. So rook a c8 was played, and now I actually went queen d2. And my idea with queen d2 was just prophylaxis against rook f d8. I really did not like scenarios where my queen had to head towards the queen side, and I thought at least with queen d2, I allow myself to kind of tuck back, go to c2, and just kind of, stay closer to my king. There was a line the computer was advocating with knight d4, and the point is actually to go knight b5 and to just ignore the king side and just kind of play on the queen side. But I was extremely discouraged by this plan because I thought that I need to be wary of my king, and after a move like g4, it just seems like there's quite an initiative on the king side. I could play knight b5 here, and after knight takes b5, knight takes b5. Apparently this position is fine for white, but allowing this type of activity is not something that seemed to be reasonable to me at all. And even here, it seems like black's moves are easier than white's. Even in this endgame, the material's equal, and the computer's saying, "Oh, this is fine for white," but I'm not. This is just not a position that a human, I think, would want to play, because it seems like black is the one that has the real counterplay and potentially the winning chances if white goes wrong. It's very hard for black to go wrong in this position where he has a lot of compensation with these two bishops. So that's why I just darted back to d2. So after queen d2, black actually played e5, but the point is that if he goes with like rook to fd8 now, I just go queen c2, and this version with my queen on c2 I'm a lot more comfortable with. For starters, I can take on d8 and trade some rooks, and that kind of alleviates some of the pressure. And yeah, just having my queen on c2 is just a little bit more secure. So yeah, e5 was played, and this is actually kind of a mistake, because it weakens the d5 square first and foremost, and it also makes the d6 square a little bit more appetizing to go to, because now the queen is also vulnerable there. Instead, g4 would have been a little bit more sensible. The point is that after knight d4, h5, and you keep pieces on the board, and I am a pawn up on the queen side still, absolutely, but you keep h4, g3 is an idea, h3 might be an idea, and you just keep more of the tension in the position. e5 goes forward, but weakens some of those squares on the d file. And so very quickly, actually, I went for queen d6, trying to get into those squares, again, I am a pawn up now, so trading queens was something I would be comfortable with under the right circumstances. And given that I haven't created any major weaknesses on the king side or on the king side or the queen side right now, queen trades aren't the end of the world for me, even though I'm down the two bishops. So I was very enthusiastic about this. Now, I did see that he probably wasn't going to trade queens. That didn't seem very sensible to me. And I thought the main candidate was actually knight e6, which he wound up playing. And here I had to, really, before playing queen d6, realize that I had a move here, because the threat now is rook fd8, and then my queen, is trapped, or almost trapped. It would have to go to b4, stranded towards the queen side, and that's basically where I didn't want my queen to go. As I spoke about before, I wanted my queen to either be near the king or, trade. And so here after knight e6, I played the move knight d5, and that was essentially the crux of my strategy, was that now I'm hitting the queen on f6 and threatening knight e7 check, so it forces off, black's very good bishop on b7. And so now bishop takes d5 was played, and now I'm actually kind of getting somewhere, because I basically have a situation where now he's had to give up one of his bishops, and I'm still up a pawn. So how to take, you may ask? Well, I decided to play rook takes d5, and I thought this was by far the most precise, because I wanted to retain control of the d file first of all, and also attack the e pawn. I thought this was very important. If I play a move like c takes d5, I'm attacking the e6 knight, but after knight c5, I think this position is very, very difficult for white to play, because now the queens do wind up coming off the board. But after bishop takes f6, e4 is a serious idea, and even though I'm a pawn up here, I don't like how my queen side pawns are. They're both on dark squares, kind of awkward. And I think you play g4 to move this knight off of this d4 square, and then you play e4, and the bishop reigns supreme on this diagonal. So really did not want the queen exchange under these circumstances. And so I thought rook takes d5 was very sensible. And the key point here was that after rook d8, which was actually played, I actually have the move queen takes e5. And this is huge that this is a move, because the point is that if you go rook takes d5, after c takes d5, even though it appears that black is actually winning a piece with queen takes d5 and knight takes e5 and bishop takes, the e6 knight is actually hanging at the end. So I actually retain my material advantage, essentially being, I'm 2 pawns up for the moment, but I'll be 1 pawn up in a second. If he captures here, I have a move like bishop c4, or excuse me, yeah, bishop c4, just, and, keeping the white advantage because e7 is a threat, and I'll play a4 next and remain a pawn up with better prospects. So the key point was that I can actually get greedy and take a second pawn because after c takes d5, I'm attacking the e6 knight. So after queen takes e5, queen e7 was played, and now the position is actually extremely unclear and messy because we have a scenario now where I actually am 2 pawns up, but my queen is getting chased around and lacking some squares. So after queen e7, I pretty much have to go queen g3. It's really the only square I can go to. And you can see my queen side is a little bit vulnerable now. This bishop can swoop in. And my queen is really lacking squares here, right? There's no real squares going forward. So I have to be wary of something, challenging my queen, maybe getting forked. But I also have great control in the center right now because my rook is anchored on d5, and I might be able to double in a moment. So here, black actually played knight c5, and this move makes some sense because the knight is actually headed toward e4, challenging the queen on g3, and if knight e4 and my queen has to go to h3 as the only move, then g4 actually seems to fork my queen and knight. But actually turns out that knight c5 is actually a losing move. With the best play, knight c5 can be refuted. So why don't you pause the video and try and figure out how this knight c5 move can be refuted, because it's actually a losing move. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and kind of weigh the consequences of knight c5 and what white can do next. I did not find the best move in the position. I actually messed up the move order. But the best move here, and the move that wins, is actually knight d4. And the problem for black here is actually f5 is just hanging. And now that my knight is off of f3, knight e4 challenges my queen, but I can just step aside and not get forked. And so basically, after knight d4, if knight e4 is played, queen h3 now adds a third piece to the fire on the f5 pawn, and you can try and exchange, but f5 is still sensitive. And if you make a move like g4 challenging my queen, I just go to queen h5, and my queen is not trapped here. I still have the g6 square, and f5 is still being attacked, and also knight e6 is also an option. So it's just a winning position because white is 2 pawns up and the queen's not trapped, and if white's able to coordinate, that's it. And if you play a move like bishop takes d4, trying to cut your losses here, after e takes d4 and king g7, my queen just re-enters the game with decisive effect. Like if queen d6, bishop f3, queen takes d5, rook e1, I'm still a pawn up here with the better minor piece, and very, very comfortable position. So yeah, this would have, knight d4 would have been a huge game changer, but I failed to appreciate that my queen would still be secure after, queen h3 and queen h5. And actually, more importantly than that, I also, didn't fully appreciate that that g4 wouldn't necessarily be a huge threat anymore, forking my my queen and knight, because my knight's no longer on f3. Instead, I played rook takes d8. And my idea with rook takes d8 was that if the queen captures, I actually play rook d1 and then get my queen in. So that I thought would be fine for me. And if rook takes d8, now the f5 pawn is actually not protected. It's unprotected. So I thought now in certain lines I can actually challenge that pawn and it's not as big a deal. And so here after rook takes d8, now I actually went knight d4, and this was my idea, was that now with knight d4, I'm actually attacking the f5 pawn with tempo and securing the f3 square for my queen. But unfortunately, this move order allows black a very, very important resource, which I'd seen leads to a forced draw, and he actually went for this line. But you could see that with the other move, or if I went knight d4 right away, I'm actually just winning. And so basically after knight d4, bishop takes d4 is played. It's accurate move. It's a correct move, and I need to play e takes d4. And this was my idea: is that my e pawn that now becomes a d pawn attacks the c5 knight. So it's not a problem for me that my e2 bishop is hanging because I can just take on c5. But after queen takes e2, which was played, and d takes c5, now black has the very, very important rook d1. And rook d1 would actually challenge this rook on f1 and threaten mate. And because of that, after d takes c5, I actually offered a draw, because I actually seen that after rook d1, I have to give her perpetual with queen b8 check, king d7, queen c7 check. And if the king stays on goes back to the 8th rank, then I go queen b8 check. But if the king goes to g6, I have to go queen c6 check. And this is the key point, is that the king, if it goes back, I give a check on b7 or on c7. And if it steps up to h5, I actually have queen f3 check, which actually forces off the queens and would lead to an endgame that would be probably winning for me, because I'd have 4 versus 2 or 3 versus 1 on the king side or on the queen side in a moment. So you can't actually trade queens and step up to h5. And because of that, the king would have to, basically shuffle on the 7th and 8th ranks. And that's why after b takes c5, we'd both seen this rook d1 move in this particular scenario. And my opponent Igor agreed to the draw. What can I say? Pretty interesting game. Definitely not the opening I was expecting or had prepared for. And I didn't lose the game. I didn't win the game, but I didn't lose it either. And that was important for me, because again, my goal going into it was to not lose no matter what, and then take the chances if I had them. Unfortunately, I didn't find the winning line when it was presented to me, but it was complicated, and I was happy to have navigated the opening that was somewhat complex in a reasonable manner. And so yeah, that was the circumstance. So actually, after this game, I was now on 6.5 out of 9. And honestly, I thought that might actually clinch it, because I knew I'd be playing a strong Grandmaster in the last round that would just improve my average rating. And I thought with 6.5 out of 9, that might be a norm score, because I'd played now 5 Grandmasters through 9 rounds above 2,600 FIDE. But believe it or not, I checked I got some calculations from some friends back in the U.S. and some friends in Denmark, and it actually turned out that my performance rating after this game was like 2597 or something like that, and the performance rating for a GM norm needs to be 2,600. So much to my dismay, it turned out that I still needed a positive result, either a draw or a win in my last round game. And my God, that really kind of pissed me off, because I knew I was going to be black in my last round. So anyways, I had to wait on the pairings and figure out what was happening, but it turned out that even with this draw with white against another 2,600 player, I had not clinched the GM norm yet. So it was all going to come down to round 10, and we'll see what happened in round 10 in the next video. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.